Hello, we are back with the Grad Club series continued. I am lucky to be joined today by author extraordinaire Tanis Rideout.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here.
It's nice to be home.
Oh, that's nice. So home, what does that mean to you? What's your connection here to the Grad Club?
Well, I mean, I've spent a lot of nights here, but I went to high school here in Kingston and then stayed on and went to Queens and came to see lots of shows here. I launched my first ever poetry collection here. I took writing classes here. I've spent a lot of time in this building.
So you launched your first poetry collection here. Paint a picture. Give me what happened. Did you do a reading here?
I did. That was, I don't even know what year that would have been, 2005, 2000, somewhere around there. And it was a collection of poems they were all in the voice of superhero girlfriends. And it was self-published, and I would often show up to readings in like sort of vaguely superhero-esque outfits. There was a lot of like fake leather pants in those days and things like that, and a lot of dark eyeliner. Pretty different vibe than now.
Oh wow, bring him back. If you brought him back, I know that would be well supported. You know. And you said you also took some classes here. I
did. My first ever writing class was with Carolyn Smart, who's the writing professor here at Queen's for ever and ever and ever. And we used to have class upstairs once in a while and then stick around for lunch. And
you were telling me a bit earlier about when you first applied to get into this class, because I'm pretty sure that this class is still a hot ticket class at Queen's.
Well, there are now more writing classes at Queen's than there was when I was here, which is great. It'd be great if they kept expanding. But I kind of decided I wanted to be a writer while in a class at Queen's. I have a very visceral memory of that, actually. And I was in a CanLit class in Sterling Hall, I think, and sort of had this very visceral moment. We were reading In the Skin of a Lion by Michael Ondaatje, and sort of had this like real sudden physical understanding that somebody was on the other side of that book, that somebody had written that book. And like I read tons, and like I wrote terrible poems in high school, as we all did, and like took creative writing, whatever that workshop class was in high school. Writer's Craft, I think.
Writer's Craft. Oh yes, still around? I think it's still called Writer's Craft. Right? Oh yeah, I remember.
And anyway, so I was reading this book and like sort of realized that like this person who was still alive, was Canadian, lived not terribly far from where we were, and I was like, and like wrote a book and like decided to do that. He wasn't hired to write a book, and I was like, maybe I could do that. I was hanging out with a lot of musicians at the time in Kingston and lots of creative people, and I was like, maybe I could be a writer. And so I kind of started to take myself very seriously kind of from that moment on. I was like, I want to be a writer. And so the only option was Carolyn's writing class, and I applied. You had to like submit a portfolio of like, I don't know, 20 pages or something. So I took my very precious poems and sent them, and she rejected me. She did not let me in her class, and I was very sad, but I was like, okay, but I really want to do this. And so I called her at her office, and I was like, hi, you like didn't let me into your class, but I was hoping you could maybe give me some feedback on the poems so that like I can apply again and hopefully get in. And she's like, oh, okay, well, I'll give them another read and I'll be in touch with you. And I was like, okay, great. And she read, whether or not she read them over again, I assume she did, but like a few days later, she called me back and was like, I want to invite you to come to the class. And it was sort of my first like real writing lesson, and it's one that I've like used over and over again. Was like, ask for the feedback, take the feedback, like don't be precious about your work. I worked when I got my first novel published, my now editor, I think read drafts of the manuscript like 3 times before she finally accepted it. And she would be like, hey, so I'm not going to publish your manuscript, but do you want to get together and talk about it? And I was like, okay, well, when an editor from McClellan and Stewart says that they will give you feedback, you take it. So I'd be like, yes. And we would like, I'd meet her after work, after like she was done editing for the day, and she would spend like an hour with me in a coffee shop and tell me like what was wrong with the book, what to do about it, like listen to me about it, and I would go away, and she always made me energized about it as well. And so I would go away and I'd rewrite it and I would send it off again, and then finally like the third time she was like, all right, it's time.
It's ready now.
It. Well, then we edited for a year and a half, but but it was like, yeah, it was like the first lesson that I ever really learned from a writing professional. And I think the most important one, take the feedback. And I'm sure that's why Carolyn let me in the class, was because I called her up and I was like, how can I be better?
I want it, right? Yeah, I'm open to it.
That's what the class was also about. So it was a lesson that has served me very well. The night the Missy arrived, torches shuddered in the wind, tossing sparks up into the clouded sky. There were no stars, only the night creeping close to dancing circles of firelight. The surf rang in measured booms against the beach, reminding Fina of her heartbeat pounding in her head when she swam in the sea. She should have been watching the sand under Mother's torch, eyes sharp for the quick scurry of crabs as the ocean retreated. Instead, Fina watched the embers from the burning palm frond Mother held overhead float skyward. If Fina stared hard at the flicker and shine of sparks before turning her head towards the invisible horizon, their patterns duplicated themselves, making a spatter of stars where there should be none, like spirit images only she could see. There were crabs everywhere. The ancestors must have been well pleased with their people to send the creatures in such bounty, and so the hunt was a kind of celebration. All around Fina, women and children sang and watched for the crabs, waiting for the sea to recede and then grabbing them when they were exposed in the backwash of the sand. She loved the crab season. The people of Middle Grove would feast on them, and when they'd had their fill, they would trade them upland in exchange for the bald pigs that were their taboo animal. And in this way, they maintained the fragile yet blossoming peace between the uplanders and Middle Grove. Fina, Mother said, shaking the flaming frond in her hands so the sparks showered over her. Pay attention. As the water pulled back from her ankles with the familiar tug of the deep, Fina's fingers seized the shell of a crab who raised his pincers in anger. The basket Fina had woven that morning while watching over her younger brother and sister was almost full with the snap of claws. She added the new crab and watched as the creatures scrambled over each other, fighting to climb to freedom. Then she stared at the rising string of sparks again before turning back to look at the sea. This time, the stars the sparks made did not fade from her vision. She rubbed at her eyes. The stars remained on the horizon. What were those lights? They were not true stars. The night was too dark, too solid for that. The torches and the white foam at the reef that marked the farthest boundary of their territory were the only brightness. No star Fina knew was the color of those in the distance, which were the color of hearth fires and sat just as low to the horizon. As she raised her arm to point at the lights, an ember landed on her wrist and burned her flesh, marking her. She grimaced in pain, but still she shouted through the intricate harmonies of the song being sung around her. Look.
Fast forward to 2022, and we're here talking and celebrating your newest book, The Sea Between Two Shores.
Yeah.
You want to tell me a little bit about what the book is about?
Yeah, it's my first novel was a really simple elevator pitch. This one is not. It's a much more complicated book, but it's essentially about two families who, one from Toronto and one from a fictional island in Oceania in the South Pacific, who come together to kind of reconcile their collective past. So there's an historical component, which is about the first missionaries arriving on this very isolated island and what happens there, told from the point of view of a young girl who's living on the island. And then the bulk of the novel is these two families who are reckoning with what happened sort of almost 200 years ago, and how that's still kind of playing out for them in the present day, and the griefs that we carry, and how what was really kind of pushing me as I was writing the book was like kind of contemplating how we make good from so much that we've done wrong in the world. Yesterday, as we're filming this, yesterday was the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and it's sort of a lot of those kinds of questions of like, how do we individually make good for what happened long before we were here, and is still playing out and is still affecting so many people's lives.
I love this, and I'm a big fan of. Do you know Dylan Robinson?
No.
So Dylan Robinson was a prof at Queen's, and now he's out in BC, and also a creative writer and a scholar, and writes about music and also writing. And one of the things that he writes about is he's like, there's a real task for especially white people like myself who are looking back at these kind of historical questions. You got to work it out amongst yourself. Like, you got to write about it. You got to have conversations. Yeah. So I was really excited to read about the book and to see that, I feel like a novel is a great place to start unpacking these huge questions about culpability.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great forum. I mean, obviously, I love it, but I always tend to write from a question or a not understanding or, something that I can't grasp. Yeah. And I definitely don't feel like I came to any answers with this book. I have no prescriptions for people to be like, let's just do this and we'll all be fine. Because it can't be that easy. Yeah, it's not easy, right? Yep. But the characters are kind of pushed towards something that I hope is hopeful as well. I think that's really important these days, is trying to find hope through these things. And it can feel really awful and hard, and it's stuff that we want to hide from or shrug off or be like, well, it wasn't me, or and trying to find kind of glimmers of light around it, I think, is really important. To be like, no, this, yes, it's hard work and we have to make amends and try and do well, but that's amazingly exciting.
Yeah, there's something on the other end.
It's maybe we're taking things apart, but we also get to build something.
Yes.
And that's, I think, an exciting way to look at it, instead of being terrified of what we might lose, thinking what we might gain from making some substantial changes.
You don't want to be deterred, right? You want to feel called toward.
Yeah, you want to be engaged, right? I think we're fighting that on so many fronts these days, as progressives and liberals, of you got to keep people hopeful or they're not going to show up.
Right. One of the things that I was reading another interview of yours, and I saw that you were naming some of the other influences for this book, and I saw that two of books that I really love that are also Kingston authors, which is A Nocturne by Helen Humphreys and Conversations with Canadians by Lee Maracle, who I think I met once at a Writers' Fest event here in Kingston. But I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit more about maybe the book's lineage or how it's connected to these other pieces for you.
I read everything. There's this kind of astounding thing that happens for me, and I think most writers or creators, when you're in a project, that suddenly everything you kind of take in becomes fodder for it and feels influential, and you can be reading a comic book and it suddenly feels, you're like, oh, well, this is relevant to this thing that I'm so inside. And but I read a lot of Indigenous literature, in particular in Canadian First Nations, but also I read a lot of South Pacific writers and New Zealand writers and Maori, and tried to kind of get a grasp on, yes, how colonialism is the same everywhere, but also how it's very different everywhere. And the Lee Maracle book in particular, conversations with Canadians, I keep using the word unsettled in a very particular, that these kind of works should unsettle you. They should, I found a difficult book. I've gone back to it. I find it, it's not easy to sit with, some of the stuff that's in it, but trying to write from very different perspectives than myself in this book, as it was just a fundamental piece of the research. And then the other big component of the novel is grief. Both the families have lost sons recently, and so I read so many memoirs about kids drowning. God, there's a lot of drowning memoirs out there.
Yeah.
But also Helen's book, which is about her losing her brother quite quickly, and just grief is a really hard thing to write. Grief is really boring when you're. It's very still. There's not a lot of. That's the whole difficulty of grief, and working through it is there's no movement. You have to eventually move through it. So writing it takes a particular kind of set of work, and Helen is very evocative about what that feels like, and the pains of that too, as you do start to move through it. Has its own grief too. When you start to kind of get over a grief, there's a heartbreak in that too, right?
Yes.
That you've moved past this thing, you feel like maybe you're forgetting the person, or, you know, like you don't want to get better, you know, like you want to kind of sit with it as long as you can. So, and she like kind of has all of that moving through that book. We're going in there, Jacob says when Zach arrives at his side, gesturing at the rock wall that rises straight up into the air in front of them, black and jagged. There's nothing to see except the mass of it. We're climbing that? A spike of fear, an anticipation of pain. No, we're going in. Jacob points at the waterline, and when the waves pull back, there's the shadow of a hole in the rock that only breaks the surface of the ocean. Fear scrapes deliciously along Zach's spine. The ocean pushes Zach back and forth, a nautical sway that makes him stumble as though he's stoned. How do we get in? We swim through. It's a short tunnel, easy to swim, but you have to time it right so that the sea pushes you through. Zach knows he can swim long distances underwater, no problem. He can make a whole length of the school swimming pool and then most of the way back before coming up for air. And even then, he's not gasping. But swimming while finding his way in the dark of an unfamiliar tunnel? That's the best time, Jacob continues. So the water is pushing you in through the tunnel. But it's okay if you time it wrong. You'll see the opening as soon as you're underwater. I've done it since I was a boy. Here, Jacob takes a snorkeling mask from around his neck and hands it to Zach. You'll be fine. Want me to go first or you? Zach doesn't know. If Jacob goes before him and gets stuck, then Zach will get stuck behind him and they won't be able to get out. But how will he know when to go without Jacob here to tell him? You go first? Jacob nods. Count to 30 and then wait for the ocean to tug you out a little. And then he makes a diving movement with his hands. You'll come out on the other side. Jacob plunges into the water and Zach watches the shape of him move towards the hole. Suddenly, he is alone, the colossal blank weight of the Pacific Ocean pushing and pulling at him. If he slipped under right now, no one would ever know what happened to him. He would just disappear off the face of the earth. He looks back at the endless splay of horizon, the most emptiness he has ever seen. He could set out for it, the horizon. He's a strong swimmer. How far would he get? And then what? Then he'd be the mystery. He'd be the wonder of it. He'd be the disappeared one. The ocean never used to scare him. Zach plunges his hand into the water, the salt stinging him back to himself. As he's done numerous times since Dylan drowned, he focuses on the pain, a way to keep the ache away, a way to keep going. He inhales deeply and holds his breath, holds it until his head starts to spark, his vision begins to narrow. He tries to be with Dylan for those last moments his brother was alive, but he can never quite reach him, because despite everything, Zach knows he can just start breathing again. He pulls on Jacob's mask. The tempered glass is foggy and spotted with salt and water. He swallows several quick gulps of air, filling his lungs, breathing deep into his diaphragm. He has to go. Jacob is waiting for him. The next push, the next swell of the water, and he will. And then he dives into the water, the sea pushing behind him, and he is in the tunnel, careening towards the bright spray of light only a few meters ahead. He's almost reached it when the ocean grabs him and hauls him back into darkness. His body slams into the wall of the cave, and he feels the skin on his back tear before he is somersaulted by a surge of water. He is turned around, the adrenaline metallic in his mouth. The water glows with daylight in both directions. Either way is safety, either way is air. He concentrates on the burn in his lungs, the salt sting of his back, and he is fighting. His hands claw at the ocean, his feet kick against it, but he isn't moving. He's held in a tightening fist. And is this what Dylan felt? This panic, this terror? He can't breathe anymore, but just then the ocean lets him go, and suddenly he's free, gulping lungfuls of air. There's a yell, and he sees Jacob standing in a column of light shooting down from the roof of a cave 50 feet above him. Zach paddles himself in a circle, barks a sound he realizes a laugh. Holy fuck! His voice bounces around the space, slides fast across the water. Holy fuck indeed, Jacob echoes.
Even in hearing you speak, and also, you know, listening to you read earlier, it's clear that water is a big influence for you, and you've got a real call towards it. And again, I was reading that you were the poet laureate of Lake Ontario.
I was. I think I still am.
They
haven't taken my sash
That kind of
away.
title never wears out.
That's right. They haven't taken my sash away yet.
So tell, what does that mean?
I was pretty lucky early on in sort of my creative career, and like in Kingston, and as I mentioned, I hung out with a lot of musicians, and my friend Sarah Harmer, who you guys know and love, was sort of one of my first introductions to kind of environmental activism and using art to kind of get into that. And so initially, like Sarah had invited me to write a poem for her escarpment tour years ago, whenever that was, which is now an ongoing concern again. It seems like there's always a new fight on the escarpment, or a continuing fight on the escarpment.
Very cyclical. It's a bit like bleak.
Honestly, and I'd never used writing like that in that way before, and so it was like trying to find a way into that was really interesting, and sort of through that I got to know Mark Matson at what was then Lake Ontario Waterkeeper and is now Swim Drink Fish, and he loved the idea of what Sarah was doing and wanted to try and find ways to use art. And Gord Downey was doing a lot of work with them at the time, and trying to figure out a way to use art to connect people to their place. And he was like, what if you became the poet laureate of Lake Ontario and you would write poems for our events and things like that? And I was like, okay. And again, like kind of had to find a way into giving the lake to people and how to like articulate that, and sort of started just writing a couple of poems for events, and then we did a tour with Gord and Mark and myself and a dancer, Andrea Nan, who's spectacular, that we did a few shows. We did one here in Kingston and had our after party at the Grad Club.
Yes.
And yeah, sort of, and that became this whole thing. I was doing my MFA at the time, and my thesis became poems about Lake Ontario called Arguments with the Lake, which is about the history of the lake and about Marilyn Bell, who was the first person to swim across Lake Ontario. And it became sort of a real thing for me. And I love coming back to Ontario, and like I go and visit the lake. I miss it. It's such a part of so much of my life growing up. I lived on the military base here for years as a young kid, and then I lived on an island in the middle of the Atlantic for a number of years when I was young. So like water is, even the readings that I did, I was like, oh yeah, it's like all water. I mean, it takes place on an island, of course it's all water, but yeah, I was like, oh no, it's always there. And now I live in Los Angeles, where water is always a topic of conversation.
It is,
so,
I bet.
I
bet being there and then coming back to Lake Ontario, and even just flying over into Ontario and seeing all of these bodies of water.
So much water here, right? It's just like it's everywhere. We're really lucky, and I really need to take care of them. And I think, so the idea of like attaching people to their place, giving them a narrative about the place, reminding them that it's there. It has a story. It has a personality. It has multiple personalities that it's different from day to day, and
that is one of the best parts about living in Kingston too. Is this multiple personalities of the lake, right? You can go down on a Monday and it's still like glass, and then you go 6 hours later, and all of a sudden it's these crashing, kind of waves, right?
It's pretty magical.
So I want to talk a bit more about your environmental activism, and Kingston and Kingston, Queens, the Grad Club specifically have a long history of being complicatedly connected to environmental movements. And I'm curious, are you doing other kinds of environmental activism with this book, or what are you working on these days in that?
I've been thinking a lot. So Vanuatu, which is the country that my fictional island is part of, is a tiny country in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's 90 some islands, I think, make up the country, and it's got jungles and volcanoes, and it's just like this extraordinary place. But like so many of those islands, they're at such high risk with climate change. But Vanuatu is kind of like leading this insane charge on the national stage. So I'm trying to figure out a kind of our international stage to kind of amplify that and try and be part of that as much as like my own backyard here, what used to be my backyard. But they just called for a fossil fuels treaty, an international fossil fuels treaty, like they did with that was done with landmines like all those years ago, that they're like put this out onto the world stage to be like, no, we need to get like all of these countries to sign this treaty to say that we are going to be done with fossil fuels, and it needs to be done because tiny countries like this that have very little political clout in the wider world, but it's on their doorsteps. Like, it's already happening. The islands are already disappearing, and they're already, I think they're beyond carbon neutral. I think they're carbon negative at this point in time. Wow. They're doing all of this work, and the behemoths like the US and us and, Europe are still kind of toddling around doing little tiny incremental things. And so trying to kind of like make that kind of more part of the conversation that we're having about, taking care of our water here, or their, water conservation in California. All of these things they're all the same question, right? And we definitely spend so much time being kind of isolated in our silos about being worried about our backyard, or, but it's all the same.
Wow. And I love hearing you talk. I think you're making some really fundamental connections in all of these differences too, right? Like fundamentally connecting colonization to the climate crisis, fundamental connection. And you're totally right. All of these different, sovereign nations around the world struggling as a result of both colonization and the impending climate crisis, right? Like, wow.
Yeah, it's all the same stuff. And it serves the powers that be if we try and keep it as like these separate little things, like, oh, their fight is not tied to our fight, but it's all connected. Now I sound like a crazy paranoid person. It's all connected.
No, but I think especially in the hands of narrative, right? Like, I think, again, I'm really moved to hear you talk about the power of creative work in these connections, in these larger kind of, the narrative that we're telling ourselves anyways.
Yeah, I think it offers people an easy way to engage with things as well. If you can give people a story, somebody to root for or root against, or what have you, that you can make a connection in that way. It's seen, if it's just this like big problem over there,
abstract,
then it's meaningless. But if you read a novel by a First Nations writer that tells you a story about a residential school, or about what it's like to live in Toronto as a First Nations person now, like, that does everything for a reader, especially a reader who doesn't necessarily think about those things, that it isn't top of mind for. If you can like give them a way into the conversation, I think people want to take that, but I think it can seem so impossible from the outside to think about these enormous things that it feels like we don't have a lot of power in. But the more of us who talk to each other, the more we do.
So speaking about talking to each other and finding ways to bring people in, I want to talk a bit more about all these exciting collaborations that you've had, because even you and I were talking earlier, I'm like, I don't understand why more musicians don't bring poets along, right? And so, you were mentioning you were on a tour with Gord and working with a dancer, which I'm going to go YouTube that when I get home. But also you went on Sarah Harmer's escarpment tour as well. I wonder if you could speak a bit more about that kind of collaboration as a poet and a writer.
I mean, it's such a gift as a writer when, like somebody like Sarah or Gord's like, hey, do you want to come along? You're like, yes. Nobody ever listens to me. Are you kidding? Like, you're going to give me 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever on your stage. Like, yes, please. But it's also, writing is pretty lonely work.
Totally.
Musicians get other friends and get bandmates and all of that sort of stuff to play with. And I spend most of my time by myself with my laptop. And so to be able to like go out and talk to people, or like be on a stage with other people is just such a gift. And to be able to have conversations and again, like make these connections and realize like we're all kind of trying to do the same things. I don't know, I keep trying to tell Sarah she needs a writer on her tour, but
all the time
she hasn't invited me back in a while.
My gosh. How fast I would go to a concert. Just like, it's a double whammy. It's a 2-for-1. I guess to see like a favorite musician and also listen to poetry.
And it also, like, let's be honest, sometimes readings are really dull. So if you can like have it like interspersed or like accompanied by like some great music, sometimes it makes it go down a little easier.
All right, this is our next project, Tanis. You and I can like, start a union, get all these like poets, musicians working together. Last thing is, I want to just hear kind of what's next for you. Like, what do the next 6 months look like for you?
Yeah, it's so literally the novel just came out, and so I've got a couple of gigs coming up in Ottawa, and I've got an online thing with the Lethbridge Library, which I assume will be just available on their website eventually. And starting on something new, headed back to Los Angeles in a week and a half, and I've got a new novel that's slowly ticking away, and then, hoping to be kind of back out in the spring we're going to put out the paperback in the spring, so it'll be another new beautiful cover, I'm sure, because the cover of this book is
Gorgeous.
Ridiculously beautiful.
It's beautiful.
And just kind of, trying to get it into people's hands, trying to talk about it and get people to read it, and then, think about all of the things that I hope it brings up. So I hope it finds some people. I think it will.
Is there anything that we missed that you want to mention while we still have the cameras rolling?
I don't think so. This was great. It's nice, like I said, it's nice to be back. It's always a good excuse to come to Kingston.
Well, thank you so much
Thank
for joining
you.
us for this reading, Tanis, and to have this conversation with me.
great.
It's so nice to have you back here at the Grad Club and in
Thanks.
Kingston. Check out Tanis Rideout's new book, The Sea Between Two Shores, available
Everywhere. It's at Novel Idea right now. I just signed some copies.
Go to Novel Idea, get a signed copy. Thanks so much,
Thank
Tanis. It was
you.
so nice to chat with you.
Thanks.
Thank you.